When my husband was growing up in the suburbs of Southern California, he and his friends loved to ride bikes, play music together, and conduct paramilitary training in their backyards. They fully expected to grow up to be soldiers who would fight in a literal war to defend their families, their faith, and the U.S. Constitution. They shot guns. They read every military book they could get their hands on, including the Anarchist Cookbook, which explains how to make explosives. They practiced driving their parents' minivans backwards through their neighborhoods so that they could someday maneuver armored vehicles away from enemies. I didn't know any of this when I started dating my husband in college. He seemed pretty chill and normal to me, and he turned out to be the best partner I could have hoped for. If he hadn't told me those stories, I would never have guessed that he had been so obsessed with war when he was younger. This brought up a lot of questions for me. Do boys and men naturally like war? Like, is it in their nature? Or do societal factors influence men to want to fight in wars? Are there institutions that are actively programming young men to want to go to war? And what are the effects on men who do end up fighting and killing in wars? Today, we're going to dive deep into the complicated patriarchal ideologies in the military. No matter who you are or what you think right now, you are definitely going to learn some stuff you have never heard before. I hear all the time that men cause wars and women don't. And that's one reason why it's so important to make sure women are in leadership. This is, of course, historically true. A recent Forbes article states that there's substantial evidence that female leaders tend to be more collaborative than their male counterparts. So if women were running countries, they would be more likely to work with their neighbors to find peaceful solutions to conflict. Women also tend to be more empathic, which may make them less likely to harm their enemies. By contrast, from a young age, boys tend to be more physically aggressive than girls. This may make male leaders more likely to initiate war. There are, of course, some exceptions. In the 18th century, Russia's Catherine the Great invaded peaceful neighboring countries. And in the 20th century, England's Margaret Thatcher invaded and occupied the Argentine Falkland Islands, causing many casualties. But it's not really clear if these examples say much about female nature. On the rare occasion that women are in leadership roles, they have to prove their strength and keep overcoming the bias that women are weak. To see what's natural and what's cultural, let's look at two groups of men with the same basic genetic makeup from the same exact region of the world, Scandinavia. In the 9th to 11th centuries, Scandinavians were famous throughout Europe for their violence. Viking raiders terrorized Western Europe, plundering and murdering innocent civilians. They were motivated by a warrior ideology of violence that prized courage and toughness, and the highest honor was to be killed while fighting bravely in battle. Fast forward 1,000 years, and Scandinavians are now famous for their peacefulness. Norse countries are known for low crime rates, gender equity, and overall happiness and peacefulness in their citizens, including their men. Same population, different culture. So, while nature certainly plays some part in boys and men's tendency toward war, culture plays a huge role. Let's look at some of the culture influences on our young boys and men here in the United States. A friend of mine recently told me a story of sitting through her child's Veterans Day assembly at their elementary school. In the assembly, the kids all sang the anthems for the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, and the Coast Guard, and the veterans in the audience stood up for applause during their anthem. It's a lovely tradition that honors the kids' parents and grandparents who have served. But my friend told me about her complicated feelings of wanting to honor the veterans, but being very uncomfortable watching her son watch a video glorifying depictions of machine guns, tanks, and bombs, and of course soldiers, all young men. Her feelings were further complicated because she was sitting next to a woman whose husband spent his entire career as a U.S. diplomat, living all over the world to keep the peace. During the assembly, she leaned over and whispered to my friend, "Isn't it interesting that we idolize the people who fight in the wars, but not the people who prevent the wars?" Have you ever thought about that? When's the last time we celebrated Diplomats' Day? Where's their Disneyland discount? It is interesting. And one reason that we don't celebrate war prevention is that idolizing peace and eschewing violence would present a problem to those running the defense of the country and whose jobs depend on the demand for weaponry. The defense industry is a $955 billion industry.
What level of profit are we talking about?
It's so profitable that many companies that started out making things like sewing machines, mason jars, or lamps wound up with defense contracts from the US government and started focusing most of their efforts on making weaponry because it's so profitable. Listen, I don't want to be a cynic. I'm usually not inclined to believe that people are purposely engineering society behind the scenes just to make money. But the weapons and defense industry does make its money off of war. And war requires soldiers who are willing to fight and die and kill for their government. And one tool that the government has utilized to produce such soldiers is the film industry. Think of the movies that we all grew up watching. In the final battle scene, the music swells, and in an act of incredible courage and personal risk, the hero, almost always a man, kills the bad guy to protect everyone else. Luke Skywalker blows up the Death Star. Iron Man blows up the evil overlords. James Bond shoots the crooks. Tears are shed, worlds are saved. The good guys deserve glory. The bad guys deserve death. It's all very uncomplicated in the movies. In real life, it's a lot more complicated. First of all, who are the bad guys? 20 years ago, a slew of movies cast Muslims as the undisputed bad guys. 50 years ago, communists made easy bad guys. Old Westerns often depicted indigenous tribes as the bad guys, and boy, did we get that backwards. Also, real war is not the glorified experience we see in movies. As feminist scholar Bell Hooks wrote, "Movies aimed at boys that glorify war make it appear heroic to die alone, away from home, fighting for a cause you may or may not understand. They serve as propaganda, recruiting the hearts and imaginations of boys." Normally, I would think it's crazy to assume that some intentional force is at play here, influencing the minds of young men on purpose, trying to turn them into warriors. That is crazy, right? Well, you be the judge. Did you know that the Department of Defense has funded and overseen the scripts for more than 2,500 movies and shows since 1930? Because I didn't know that. Each branch of the armed forces has its own intermediary to the film and television industries. The Department of Defense created an actual partnership with the film industry during World War II for propaganda purposes.
Fighting, living, dying. For what? To be free.
From 1942 to 1945, the United States Office of War Information's Bureau of Motion Pictures reviewed 1,600 film scripts. They revised or discarded any scripts that portrayed the United States or war in general in a negative light. Pro-peace, anti-war scripts were not approved. And the Department of Defense has blatantly tried to hide its involvement. In 1953, then U.S. President Eisenhower said, "The hand of the government must be carefully concealed," and in some cases, I should say, wholly eliminated in the field of entertainment, dramatics, music, and so on. As an example, the film Animal Farm came out in 1954. 40 years later, historian Tony Shaw discovered that the CIA had secretly purchased the rights to the film and altered the ending so that the pigs, representing the communists, were overthrown by the other animals. The government was secretly interfering in the arts to create political propaganda. At other times, though, the Department of Defense doesn't hide its involvement at all. After the Vietnam War, public perception of the military was extremely low and recruitment was lagging. The U.S. Navy needed to rebrand its image, and it did so with the movie Top Gun.
Tom Cruise, Kelly McGillis. Top Gun.
The Department of Defense worked closely with the producers and directors on the script. They even set up recruiting tables outside movie theaters all over the country the weekend of the film's premiere, resulting in an 8% increase in Navy recruits that year. Perhaps movies with barely concealed American propaganda like Top Gun might seem like obvious projects for the government to be influencing behind the scenes. But what about movies that aren't overtly about America, but still glorify violence? The government funds and oversees plenty of those too. Just for fun, let's see a small sampling of some of the movies that the Department of Defense was involved in funding and overseeing. And it's certainly not just movies. The Department of Defense also works with video game creators. The first digital video game, Space War, was created with funding from the Pentagon. America's Army is a first-person shooter game publicly available for anyone to play for free.
The only video game developed by the United States Army. Rated T for Teen.
When Doom became wildly popular in 1993, the Marine Corps released Marine Doom 2 years later, replacing aliens with military graphics. The writer for the popular game Call of Duty is a full-time advisor for the Department of Defense. And if that isn't shocking enough, how about the fact that the Department of Defense isn't just using video games and movies to prime the propaganda pump? The U.S. military has provided over $55 million to professional sports organizations like the NFL and NASCAR in exchange for pro-military messaging. Have you ever noticed how the athletes salute active duty soldiers and war vets? That's not just patriotism. That salute was bought and paid for by the military. Here's another really important thing to know. When military recruiters set up their tables outside of movie theaters and at football games, and yes, they do that, the boys who end up recruited are disproportionately from low-income and marginalized populations. Black men are overrepresented in the military, making up 20% of military personnel, but only 13% of the general population. American military recruiters also disproportionately visit schools in low-income communities. They famously offer assistance with college tuition, which can be a real help to young students. But if and when America does end up in a global conflict, low-income and marginalized groups are the first to be put in harm's way.
The reason you're there is because some rich people want to use you and you're poor. If you weren't poor, you wouldn't be there. I mean, if you had a father who was a businessman, you wouldn't be there.
This is the most upsetting part for me. When people ask me how patriarchy harms men, I immediately think of leaders of countries, almost always men, who sit safely in their palaces and send other people's children, mostly boys, to die, or if they survive, to deal with physical and psychological damage for the rest of their lives. That's patriarchy. A small group of men exploiting or exerting power over other men, and it's happened all throughout history. And even when military service is freely chosen, even when soldiers are not cannon fodder, but instead are highly trained, brilliant, skilled combatants who may believe in the cause they're fighting for, they still describe war as hell. I'll always remember being a kid at the dinner table when my grandma's husband started to tell us about being shot down during World War II and spending years in a prisoner of war camp. He had never talked about it before, and he never talked about it again, but I will always remember the look on his face when he talked about the violence he endured and his friends dying. As we know, survivors of war can sustain severe physical injuries, and so many suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety for years or decades after the fighting is over. Many veterans struggle to find employment. They may have acquired very particular, specific skills while deployed that don't translate easily to civilian life. So even highly trained elite soldiers can come home and struggle to find jobs, which can lead to poverty and even homelessness. Veterans who return with PTSD have a 78% divorce rate, and relationship breakdowns lead to further depression. Even the veterans I know who are grateful for what they learned in the military and are proud of their service say that war is hell and not at all the Captain America vision that they were sold. So, To return to our questions at the top of the episode, do boys and men naturally like war, or do societal factors influence men to want to fight in wars? I would say the answer is it's hard to tell exactly what's biological and what's cultural, but culture makes a huge difference. Next question. Are there institutions that are actively programming young men to want to go to war? This was the craziest part for me. Yes, the US government has been pumping war messaging into our culture on purpose. Not surprisingly, war is devastating for all involved. Veterans need compassion and support when they come home from combat. And the people who our government tells us are the bad guys, too often they are just other people's children, caught up in a machine that chews them up and spits them out just like ours does. So, in conclusion, I would rather that we as a society stop spending our resources cultivating a culture of violence and instead spend our resources preventing violence. I suggest that we invest more in education and early childhood, and we support elected officials who value diplomacy and humane treatment of our fellow human beings all over the world. Because the best way to reduce the harm of war is to avoid war in the first place. Thanks for watching. This is a complicated topic, so please tell me what you think in the comments, especially if you have firsthand experience serving in the military or as a member of a military family. Also, please remember to like, subscribe, and pass this episode along to a friend.